Hello, this is the Overcoming Resistance podcast, and I'm your host, Louis Corral. And today we have a special guest for this episode, Michael Salazar. My co host, Sean Mahoney, is away for this particular episode. Mike is a close friend of the show and a very smart and accomplished coach and athlete in the world of physique and strength sports. We are very grateful to Mike for joining us on this episode about exercise selection for muscle growth. Please know that this episode is going to be slightly longer than our normal episodes, as this is a topic that can be quite nuanced. We hope you enjoy the show. Thanks for listening. What's going on, Mike? How you doing, man? Thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me. Pretty good, just living the dream, getting strong and getting jacked, helping others get strong and jacked.
So for those listening, usually my co-host is Sean. He's away for some personal matters, but we're lucky enough today to have a close friend of mine, somebody I trust highly with their knowledge, Michael Salazar. So Michael, why don't you tell a little bit about yourself, let people know who you are, your background in training, competitions, as well as education.
Okay. So I'm a powerlifting coach and just general fitness coach, starting to delve more into the physique side of things as well. Background, I've been training since I was like 12 years old. My oldest brother was in the military, so I remember being a kid and him handing me some dumbbells, making me do push-ups, pull-ups, stuff like that. So that was ingrained into me from an early age. That plus like watching like 90s wrestling, everyone was jacked out of their minds. And then like I would say another influence that got me into lifting was probably like early like Dragon Ball Z and stuff like that.
Oh
But
yeah, I mean, I
so
get it.
yeah, for sure, exactly. So I was lifting pretty consistently in high school, and then had kind of periods of started taking time off, not being super serious about it. Then I got more into it when I joined, is where I met you, at Orlando Barbell, and like I saw actual powerlifters. And to me, I remember at the time being just in awe of these guys moving weight that at the time to me seemed like pretty crazy. I mean, they're still pretty strong guys, but it's funny how perspective changes.
Yeah.
So, anyways, um, I went to school, got my started my AA, took some time off. Then I decided to go back to school. I was just like working regular, like kind of basic jobs. And when I went back to school, I was a lot more into powerlifting, and I saw UCF had the sport and exercise science degree. So I went for that, did a couple powerlifting competitions, very mediocre, nothing special. But I fell in love with the science of it, and I'm very much someone who loves to learn, loves to continue my education, and I still do a lot of continued education to this day. So I got my bachelor's degree. One of the professors there had said, like, hey, you're really into this. You should apply for the master's. So I went ahead and got my master's in exercise physiology. At that time, I thought that I wanted to do like work in the research field. And then I realized that those guys are overworked and underpaid. I appreciate the work that they do, but that's not the life that I wanted to lead.
Yeah, understandable.
And so I was just kind of working at gyms for a little while. So I worked at 24 Hour Fitness, was my first personal trainer job. And that was okay, fulfilling at times, not so fulfilling at others. COVID hit. Obviously, everyone and their mom got laid off. And then I ended up working at this boot camp place for a little bit, which anyone that knows me knows that's completely antithetical to my personality type. So that was not exactly the most enjoyable experience. But this whole time, I had started to help some people out with powerlifting coaching. And so I was like, oh, I can do this online coaching thing. And so I had some independent clients as well for just one-on-one personal training. So that's when I took the leap of faith. That would have been, I believe, January of 2021. And since then, I've really, I've been lucky to have some really gifted athletes and just continue to grow, refine my approach. And now we're coming up on not far off 2 years of independent coaching. So I'm pretty happy with that. And, my team is growing. I've got a lot more competitors. So things are going really well.
Awesome, man. It's yeah, I've known you for a good couple of years now.
Mhm,
Met you at Orlando Barbell in Orlando, and obviously in Orlando. For people that
mhm.
don't know, it's a powerlifting gym. We both went to college at University of Central Florida, UFC, as you said, or UCF. I'm sorry, we weren't fighters,
Yeah.
but yeah. So I've known you for a while. To see your journey, to see you go from entering into the powerlifting space. You've done some bodybuilding shows, I believe, as well, at least one,
I did one way
right?
back
Yeah.
in the day, but
So you've
I'm
stepped
I'm
on.
looking at coming back now that with way more lean tissue, probably in 2023.
Yeah, but I mean, for those that don't know, I mean, you were a little bit heavier.
Oh
You
yeah,
know,
for
you
sure.
you
At
got
that point
into
in
it. You
time.
lost. I don't know how much total weight did you end up losing from basically your start point to the end of your
Oh yeah, I got
contest.
yeah,
I
it's funny, a
mean,
lot of people don't know this about me now, like my newer people that know me in the past couple of years, but I had gotten up to 250 and like not even remotely lean, like with not much lean tissue. Because at that time I remember this article from Elite FTS that was like, oh, you got to eat like a whole pizza with olive oil every night and go to Chinese buffets. And I'm thinking, oh, that's the way to gain weight, not doing nearly enough volume, not training close enough to failure. Like, oh, it was just a disaster. So actually, I got up to 250. So that's when I was competing in powerlifting. I was 242. And then I was like, damn, I'm fucking fat. This is after a breakup from a relationship. I was like, I'm not gonna meet any girls looking like this. I ended up dieting for like 9 months. I got all the way down to 176, I believe, from 250. So quite a big drop. And then from there, I then was a bit more intelligent in my approach to bulking and cutting cycles. And obviously my knowledge increased because I was in school at the time. Yeah, because that bulk was done before going to school for exercise science or anything like that. It was just like eat everything in sight and do like heavy singles on squat, bench, and deadlift. Terrible. Don't follow that advice.
yeah, because I definitely remember seeing that early version of you,
Yeah.
peak bulk and everything. And then,
Oh yeah.
I left Orlando for a little while and I came back and we did like some meets and you had like, you did your show, you lost a bunch of weight, then you kept a bunch of that weight off, and then you built a
Mhm.
bunch of muscle, and then your numbers just kept climbing. So, I mean, you have a good experience both. I know you say you specialize in powerlifting, but you do a lot of physique as well, right? With clients and other
Yeah.
things. You specialize in
Yes.
both areas.
I've gotten a lot more into that because I'm a big bodybuilding fan as well. And so most of my training nowadays is for myself very much hypertrophy oriented because I know I'm not going to be a champion powerlifter, and honestly, I don't find it as fun. There's times where I'll like throw in like sumo deadlifts for a block or two, or barbell bench for a block or two. But like I don't get as much enjoyment personally out of training like purely for powerlifting. Whereas I feel with more hypertrophy focused training, I have a lot more exercise selection. I can vary my rep ranges a little bit more. I'm not as tied into that ultimate goal of being good at low bar squatting, pause benching, and competition deadlifting, whether it be conventional or sumo. So it's a lot more fun for me, and it allows me to use myself as a guinea pig where I'll kind of experiment with different movements, different rep schemes, exercise orders, stuff like that. And so that's a big passion of mine, and it's a nice way to diversify my coaching as well because powerlifting is super fun and I have some incredibly talented powerlifters, but it's also fun to have a different challenge with people who have only hypertrophy oriented goals. But one thing I kind of want to talk about is that people often try to sort of differentiate these two dramatically, whereas like I've seen some physique coach programming that is almost so far away from strength training where they almost want it to be this separate entity, but the principles are still the same. Like, even if your goals aren't to be a really, really good squatter for one rep, like your leg movements should still be getting stronger over time because we know that gains in strength, like once you've refined technique, obviously, gains in strength are the result of added lean tissue. So if you take someone and you take their RDL from 225 for 10 with pretty good execution and control to 315 for 10 over the course of 8 months, like that's definitely going to result or be the result of added hamstring and glute tissue. That's not going to happen magically. So,
Right. I mean, that's a good point to make for anyone that, because they often get confused
mhm,
where sometimes people will say, no, you need to get stronger to get bigger, but it's like you're saying, it's really kind of maybe the other way around where
yeah, mhm,
because you're getting bigger, you are getting stronger.
yep,
So you progress the load and or reps to keep
exactly,
up with the stimulus to continue to
exactly.
get bigger.
And that's one of my
And
big pet peeves is you'll see sometimes these people who think they're doing hypertrophy, they'll just do a shit ton of volume, and it's like you've been doing the same sets of like, you'll see like like basically like these Instagram fitness girls, influencers, if you will, they'll be doing like RDLs with like 95 pounds for their entire life. And like if they're okay with keeping their physique and they're at a point where they're just happy with it, that's perfectly fine. But if anyone's like, I want to build more lean tissue, eventually that over time that load on the bar has to come up to keep that stimulus to a point where you have to adapt to it.
right, there's I think the research is pretty clear that there's some type of threshold that you have to
Hmm.
get over in terms of how close to muscular concentric failure
Yep.
you're getting to, for that kind of almost like the I wouldn't say it is a light switch. It's not really on or off, but to get a mostly on effect for
Hmm.
the stimulus of building muscle, you have to get close. And so if 95 pounds for a Romanian deadlift, RDL, 10 reps is 10 reps away from,
From
if you had to do
failure.
20 to get to
Yeah.
concentric failure, you're probably not really turning on those switches if, for an
Exactly.
analogy's sake.
Hmm.
But if you get closer to maybe 15 or, more reps, closer to 20, somewhere in that range, then yeah, you are starting to hit that, and thus growth can start to, be signaled, or you need to increase the load, which
Yeah.
brings the amount of reps you can do
100%.
down to match whatever you're doing. So yeah, I agree with you completely. I mean, those are good topics, and it almost segues. Not really. I'm gonna force a segue into like kind of our main topic for today. And really, the reason I want to bring you on is, for people who don't follow you, I will link all of your socials and all your things, so people can keep up with you. But you've been doing a lot of posts I've seen on the topic of exercise selection.
Hmm.
And so, that's a broad topic, because there would be differences if somebody's a powerlifter, their ideas of exercise selection would be different than somebody trying to build muscle.
Absolutely.
But today I wanted to focus on building muscle.
Hmm.
I know it's an area that you have a personal, uh, pet project. You've really been focusing on it. Like you
Hmm.
said, you've been using yourself as a guinea pig. So, um, when it comes to building muscle, are some exercises better than others? Let's start there. Is there a way that we can think about picking an exercise that, yeah, this is probably better for specifically the purpose of building muscle compared to another?
Yeah, for sure. So when selecting exercises, you have to consider a couple different things. Is it something that we can progressively load? Is it something that has some element of stability? Because you look at something like to use an extreme example, like a squat on a Bosu ball, like you're not going to be able to load that appreciably. There's a ton of instability, so at that point it's not something that you would select for hypertrophy, because when you think of hypertrophy, we want to create enough tension, mechanical tension, or like load on the bar or resistance that you're basically having to press against or pull against. That's going to be the main driver of hypertrophy. Now, there's some discussions on whether we have like, for example, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy via metabolite accumulation, stuff like that. But like for like most people's bread and butter, it should be mechanical tension. And so when I look at what are we trying to accomplish, and this kind of depends on where someone is at in their career. So one of my biggest pet peeves is right now we have a lot of people online on like TikTok or Instagram or both who are kind of like these biomechanics experts. And I think biomechanics is really interesting, and like I'm all about, like playing around with resistance profiles and like making sure everything is more optimal, but perfectly optimal is not always the solution. So anytime I see some like 18, 19-year-old kid very, very early on, not much muscle at all, and they're doing like these super complicated, maybe not super complicated, but maybe a little bit unnecessary setups, like, like an iliac focus pull down, or like these cable press arounds. And in my head, I'm like, you don't have a base. I feel like some of those movements aren't bad, but maybe I would leave them for later on in a training session, or maybe even not something to worry about at that early stage in your development when you just need to build global tissue. So that's definitely something I consider. So like if I get someone who's like a physique athlete, I'll do a needs analysis and be like, okay, this person needs more pec and stuff like that. And I want to find exercises that they can execute. Obviously, I'll check their execution and then make sure we can just load that over time. And I think a big component that gets overlooked with hypertrophy in sort of we basically have like the pendulum has swung too far in the direction of like biomechanics and optimization from like the meathead who's doing barbell rows extremely violently with 315 and getting zero back stimulus. So we need sort of a middle ground. We do want to load and we want to try to get stronger like we just discussed, but we also want to know what are we trying to accomplish, what's the tissue we're trying to target. And I think that like with anything, a lot of times on the internet, people just lack nuance. And so people think it has to be black or white when it's really kind of a gray area of like, it depends and you have to take it on a case by case basis. But yeah, like to answer your question a little bit more directly, there's definitely exercises that are going to be more suited to target certain tissues, but sometimes we may want something that's a little bit more global. Like I'm perfectly okay giving someone very young in their development just sort of really pushing conventional deadlifts and just getting globally stronger versus maybe someone later on like myself. I every once in a while do conventional pulls just for fun, but I tend to stick with like RDLs, Romanian deadlifts, or like stiff leg deadlifts because that's going to be a little bit more targeted to that hamstring and glute tissue.
Right. I agree with you on all your major points. For some people who maybe aren't as familiar with a little bit of the background, some of the nuanced discussions, these detailed biomechanics, it's gotten to a point where instead of say doing a pull up or a pull down to build the lat muscles, people are doing very specific, unique setups to, based on what anatomy looks like in the body to get very specific angles of pull to
Mm-hmm.
maximize the lats. And what you're kind of saying, and I agree, is well, when you're when you're starting out, unless you're a high level, very experienced, you're going for the every ounce you can get.
Yep.
Is it worth taking the time to set up this very complex, almost like lat movement?
Yeah.
Maybe you can't load it as well. It's not as stable, so you can't put as
Exactly.
much
That's a good
tension
point. Mm-hmm.
through it. But you know, if you're just starting or you're more of a casual person, just do the pull downs, the pull ups, get really strong on those. They're your bread and butter. They're very
Yep.
stable. You can load them well. They're going
Mm-hmm.
to build most muscle, right? That's why they are the
Exactly.
bread and butter, the conventional things that people do, they've had success with.
Mm-hmm.
And, the new stuff, the very specific, nuanced positions, I think those are interesting. I think they're fun. I think they can be a nice way to change up a routine. If you've been doing pull ups for 10 years, you're probably a
Yeah.
little bored of pull ups.
Yep.
So these are new things. You're also probably strong enough globally that you can probably put yourself into this a more stable position by force in
Mm-hmm.
these
Yeah.
more complex setups to actually load them. If you're
For sure.
140 pounds soaking wet, it doesn't take much cable stack to start pulling you off the ground,
Mm-hmm.
right? You don't really have you don't have as much awareness of where your body is, how to angle it to. I mean, those movements you're talking about that people are doing now, they take a lot of knowing the body,
Yep.
knowing where you are in space, knowing how things feel.
Mm-hmm.
It might just be better to stick with some basic movements. I agree with you. And there's probably a gray zone, right? Where,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you want to think about it in your example. You gave the Bosu ball. Again, I'm trying to clarify for those that maybe don't have the background that we have. You gave the example of the Bosu ball squat being a bad movement for building muscle. Well,
Mm-hmm.
why is that? Well, that's because your feet are on this ball and it's unstable. So you
Mm-hmm.
can't really put much load on your body, on
Yep.
the quads, the hand, the glutes, because you're so unstable. You can't really do much tension. So the body's usually more energy and resources just to create stability. instead of actually putting load into the muscles we're trying to build. So
Hmm.
then what's a natural progression? Well, probably doing a barbell squat without the ball would be better. But
Yep.
then, like you said, it's a sliding scale. So, okay, a barbell squat would be better, but then would a machine squat maybe be even better for the purpose of building muscle than a barbell squat because the bar is up and you have some stability. Maybe with
Mhm.
the machine, you could do even more load, more tension, more specific because now the machine's locked you in, right? So it's a sliding scale. And I don't know
Yep.
if you agree with that kind of
Yeah.
scale there as an example for people to think about. You're moving along that continuum. So you gave a good broad like, hey, there's these big items going on in the discussion. People are either focused on maximizing every single muscle fiber based on where it lines up in an anatomy chart, and then
Hmm.
there you got the guys who are just like, no, 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 this is what we've always done, we're just going to do that.
Exactly.
Probably the right answer, for like you said, falls somewhere in the middle.
Hmm.
So to piggyback off that, for you've kind of given this, but I want to narrow it down for the listeners.
Okay.
What are your main factors that you consider when you're picking an exercise to build muscle? And let's use something, let's use a pec movement, right? We kind of gave a broad for a squat. We've gone through kind of the lat. Let's pick a different muscle so people can start to then get these concepts with
Okay.
examples. So let's do a pec. Let's say somebody wants to build their middle lower pec area. They're not so much focused on the top, they're just general global pec development. You're looking at picking that first bread and butter exercise to put in their routine. It's the first one on their day. It's push day, it's chest day, whatever their program is. It's upper body, push focus, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah.
Hex the movement. What are you looking at for the athlete? They want to build muscle. You want to pick a good, solid exercise.
Definitely something that we can push load over time in a stable environment. And like obviously that's going to vary. And also the enjoyment factor. Some people may not even think about that. And I just had this discussion with someone the other day that sometimes, even for myself, I'll program things that I know are a little bit suboptimal, but because I find them super fun, I know that I'm going to push that intensity and I'm going to come in with a level of dedication that, okay, I'm excited to see, like I've got maybe hit a PR at like, I got this dumbbell press for a set of 8 to 12 at 1 RIR. And let me see, okay, my prior block, I did this. Let's hope I can get better. And so creating that sort of athlete buy-in definitely matters because that's an issue I have with some of either of the extremes. People eventually will get bored of a barbell bench, but people also, I feel I would get bored of like just doing cable press arounds every single week for months at a time. So having these exercises that we can load and track that progression, and I always encourage people to keep a logbook. Now, with logbooking, you don't have to force progression every week because we know we have fluctuations in performance day to day dependent on a variety of factors. But like I said earlier, over the course of several months and obviously years, like that logbook should have significantly progressed. And I always tell people we want to standardize that execution and not force reps with like super sloppy form just for the sake of the logbook. But I would say something we can load consistently, something that's enjoyable, and something that has an element of stability to it. And
Okay.
so,
So that could be a lot of things,
yeah.
right? So maybe for the pec, that could be anything kind of along that spectrum of maybe a barbell bench press
Hmm.
to maybe like a machine press,
Yep.
right? Kind of being some of those big items. You can load them, you can add very small increments of load over time.
Hmm.
They're stable, you have the bench behind you, consistent setup, very easy to do the same movement from week to
Yep.
week. And that could be a barbell bench press, a dumbbell bench press, or a machine, right? They could all
Exactly.
fall into that. And then, of course, you might pick which one you're picking based on enjoyment, like you said, because
Hmm.
a big theme that me and my co-host has talked about is it's really consistency,
Hmm.
right? This is a long game. You got to do it
Yeah,
for a long
exactly.
time.
Hmm.
You probably want to enjoy it because the more you enjoy it, the less friction you'll have to keep doing it. So you got to, like
100%.
you said, have that buy-in. So that helps. So those are the main things, and then going from there, but an example, the barbell bench press, the dumbbell bench press, and the machine press,
Hmm.
they do all fit your model you gave of stable, you can track progress,
Hmm.
consistent execution, and then, you can load them in smaller increments to progress over time. But they aren't technically equivalent, right? There is
No.
another
Yeah.
factor that's worth thinking about, and one I know you talk a lot about, which is fatigue.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So the fatigue component, because enjoyment aside, let's say somebody says, I like all three the same.
Hmm.
So now we've gotten enjoyment. Let's say that they haven't done any of the three for a while, because
Hmm.
there is that other factor that we didn't mention, if you agree, which is, if you do the same movement for 6 months, it may not be as stimulative because of the fact you've done it for so long. It might be time to maybe try a new movement in general,
Yeah.
right? Because there's
Hmm.
none of those movements do all hit the pecs, but they all can hit those fibers slightly differently.
100%.
So okay, so we're in
I like
agreement
to,
there.
yeah, I like to rotate every couple of blocks. I mean, if someone's progressing or I'm progressing on something very consistently, I'm not going to fix it's not broken. But sometimes, even if I'm like slowly progressing on something, but I'm not enjoying it as much, I'll just swap it out for something else.
Or you could be doing everything perfect: stress management, sleep, training
Hmm.
volume, you name it, you've got all your ducks in a row and you're just not making progress on this one lift that you've
Yeah.
been doing for 6 months. It might be time to swap the lift. But let's assume, in my example, the barbell bench press, the dumbbell bench press, the machine, that's not a factor.
Hmm.
So there is the other one to consider, which is fatigue.
Hmm.
So can you explain a little bit about how exercise selection impacts fatigue management, how that
Yeah,
might be a consideration for people?
absolutely. So whenever I design programs, I try to think of that in terms of how we select exercises, not just on a single day, but within the training week. So a good example is going to be, even some people might disagree with me on this, but I'm not the biggest fan of barbell rows. The reason why is I much prefer a more stable environment like a machine row or lat pull downs, all those setups where you have more stability and you kind of save the low back, because typically I'm having people do on more of a hamstring glute focus day some sort of heavy hinging. So I mean, you can kind of play around with the how you set up your training week, but either way, like I feel like something like a barbell row is just going to cause disproportionately more fatigue to stimulus, because you are having to use the spinal erectors in that position to stabilize, had that isometric contraction to keep you in that position, when you're just better off using some sort of already stabilized machine. And so in the context of exercise selection, it sort of also depends on where you're at in terms of like maybe if you're dieting versus if you're in a calorie surplus. Like someone going into like in a prep for a show and they're pretty low on calories, high on cardio, we may want to start at that point opting for more stabilized environments just to keep that stimulus to fatigue ratio in a better spot. Though there's nothing wrong with a barbell squat, but maybe swapping for leg press or hack squat at that point is just a smarter call, because that barbell squat may cause a little bit more global fatigue and tax that low back and stuff a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense, right? You're just considering, most exercises might come with something extra. They don't,
Hmm.
it's a leg extension is pretty much just the quad. But
Yeah,
a squat hits a lot of things, and there's a lot of
exactly.
different ways to do a squat. And so those forces go through different tissues, which
Hmm.
can affect training of similar tissues later, is kind of what you're saying, right? With the barbell
Exactly.
row and the squat. But for those that maybe don't understand exactly some of this stimulus to fatigue ratio, right? Because those are kind of broader terms just to kind of help bring it around. So how would you define fatigue for someone who maybe doesn't truly understand? Like, what do you mean by fatigue? Because that's kind of a broad term, right? So,
Yeah. So fatigue is just going to be sort of just your ability to exert force, on like kind of like simplifying terms, or just kind of how you feel. And like there's so much that goes into fatigue, obviously, that you have to manage, because how much you've been training, your intensity, your total volume, obviously your nutrition, if you're in a surplus, maintenance, or deficit, life stress definitely factors, sleep, all those things. And so when we think about fatigue management, we have to be considerate of where we are in terms of everything globally happening. So when it comes to defining fatigue, we need to kind of look at it both qualitatively and quantitatively. So like, okay, are your numbers going down and how do you feel?
Right. It sounds like you're kind of just explaining like fatigue is almost like this bucket
Hmm.
where it's almost like the idea of stress. A lot of
Yep.
people know what stress is. So
Hmm.
training, any type of training you do comes with the stress. And there's eustress and distress, right? Eustress is good stress, which is what we're looking for. That's the stimulus, right? We
Hmm.
could maybe say that that's what we want, the stimulus for the adaptation we want, in this case, building muscle. Distress would be a negative stressor on us.
Yeah.
And so fatigue is kind of the accumulation of negative stressors. And kind of as maybe you were clarifying, it's, life stress. It's, if you're not eating enough food, if it's, you're
Mhm.
not sleeping well, if, you're doing all these things, too much work, too much training,
Exactly.
those are all going to come with some level of distress. And that your body can only handle so much of that. It's kind of like a sink.
Hmm.
Your body gets rid of it, but that's a drain. So you have a certain amount of a sink and you have a certain amount of drainage.
Yep.
All those stressors are going in there in the distress sink, and it's filling up, right? And so maybe exercise selection, the way you're explaining it, is some of those, like the barbell row or the
Hmm.
barbell back squat, that's going to come with some level of distress more
Hmm.
than maybe a chest supported row or
Yeah.
a hack squat, right? Am
Exactly.
I understanding where
Hmm.
you're going with that? So, and then if we were to circle back to that chest example, a barbell bench press would probably come with a higher level of distress compared to maybe a dumbbell. And then, a machine would probably come with the least.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a spectrum. So if your main goal is to build muscle, should you only do machines then? No, that's not what we're saying. I want to make that clear. But if your main goal is to build muscle and you're not a beginner, you probably, would you agree, probably have some constraints on
Yeah.
how much distress you can handle, right? A beginner.
Yeah. And I would say the absolute load that you can handle as you start to get very, very strong is going to sort of create more fatigue costs on some of those bigger barbell movements or free weight movements. So this is a reason why you see like most high level bodybuilders stick a lot with hack squats, because you have that stabilized environment. Yeah, there's no doubt some of these huge IFBB pros could be squatting, 585 plus for reps, but for them, they know that eventually there may be some form breakdown and a little bit of fatigue cost to the low back, which could then affect subsequent training sessions. And because they're more specialized in their training and they already have that global tissue, they may be thinking, let me use a hack squat where I can get a higher degree of knee flexion and a stable environment and really target that quad tissue.
Yeah. I think that's a good example, with the idea that, if somebody's just starting out, you probably can't do enough damage. The amount of
Exactly.
distress you can inflict
Hmm.
to get the right amount of eustress, the stimulus that we want, they're good. It's almost like the distress will be a +1 to them, but then they'll get rid of it by the next session. So it's a -1. So they're
Hmm.
always at a flat line. They can't do enough. But as
Exactly.
you get further into the training career, right, you start to, the barbell back squat might be a +2, but by
Hmm.
the next leg session or the next session involving similar muscles for that advanced trainee pro, they've only had a -1. So now they're at a +1 standing in my analogy here, right?
Yeah.
So they're accumulating. And so maybe they want to minimize that, because as we advance through our training career, we have to do more work to get more stimulus, or to continue to get the stimulus we need to build more muscle, right? Would you
Hmm.
agree with that idea?
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
so there's a
100%.
bottleneck in recovery.
A
And so what
100%.
you pick later on in your career can help to alleviate that bottleneck as much as possible. So that segues in my next question for you, because you have powerlifters, you
Hmm.
have physique athletes. And so obviously you're managing all their programs, you're thinking about these concepts. So when it comes to building muscle, what are some of the programming considerations you take into when it comes to exercise selection, right? What are you thinking in a weekly structure of
Mhm.
somebody? Like, what are some things you're thinking about when it comes to, okay, I'm going to pick this exercise because they have this goal and we got to do this amount of training sessions in a week, right? So you're now you're looking at how
Mhm.
does it fit into the puzzle?
Yeah, so I obviously want to think of what they may be lacking. So from a physique development standpoint, I may be a little bit more focused on attacking certain body parts more. But obviously everything is going to hit at some point. But yeah, with like for example with powerlifters, I have my powerlifters do a lot of hypertrophy work, and I always tell people, my hypertrophy, my powerlifters focus a lot on hypertrophy, and my physique athletes are still focused on getting stronger. It's that exercise selection and rep ranges may vary a bit, but those same principles still matter. And you also have to consider the context of where you are at relative to competition, both for powerlifters and physique athletes. Because with powerlifters, if we're many, many months out from competing, we can get away with things that are a little bit further away from a low bar back squat or a sumo deadlift and focus more on just kind of global tissue and global strength gain, and really push things like high bar squats or safety squat bar squats, and then push like, a dumbbell bench, things like that. Whereas as we're getting close to a meet and we start that sort of peaking and tapering process, we're pulling off a lot of that extra volume in order to allow them to perform their best on meet day. So yeah, I always try to consider, okay, where do I see maybe an area where they're perhaps weak? Like I use the powerlifter example. If someone tends to fold over a lot in their squat, um, you know, part of that could be just anthropometrics, how they're built. They're just going to be built to have a more forward lean. But sometimes they just have really weak or small quads. And so we may want to attack their quads directly a little bit more via things like a hack squat, or if maybe not available, like a heel elevated high bar squat, to where we're getting into a higher amount of knee flexion. And I may keep that somewhere around, like, I play around with the RIRs week to week, but like with something like that, I may not be trying to push them to failure all the time, but just creating that stimulus to where they can build more of that quad tissue and therefore allow them to have a little bit more upright position in their back squat. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So you're thinking about several things. Where a needs analysis, right? What
Mhm.
does the person need? And then how can we maximize the stimulus for their need while minimizing potential fatigue and drawbacks?
Exactly.
I think is what what I'm
Yes.
getting from the
So
way
like
you're
yeah, like
explaining it.
a hack squat, or an even better example, if available, would be a pendulum squat, where we're really able to get into a high degree of knee flexion in a stable environment. And I think that's like a pendulum squat's a fantastic option as an accessory movement for a power lifter, because it's going to allow you to get more of that movement pattern and really build those quads without
Right.
being as fatiguing as just doing more sets of back squat. Like you're going to have to do a certain amount of back squatting to get good at back squatting. That's obvious, but there is the consideration of fatigue accumulation. And that's also going to differ from lifter to lifter. Everyone has different ability to recover, the concept of maximum recoverable volume. So that's an area where you just kind of have to learn people's individual responses and start to play around with that total volume and exercise selection.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And for those that don't know, the term RIR is reps in reserve.
Hmm.
You basically you're estimating how many reps you are away from that concentric failure that we discussed earlier, which can be useful because like we were discussing, you do want to be somewhere near that failure point to then maximize the muscle building stimulus. So kind of having an idea that you're close is always good. The further you are from failure, the less tiring or fatiguing the movement is
Hmm.
on a global spectrum, if you agree, Mike. And
Yeah.
then the closer you are, the more fatiguing it is, which is why Mike was saying for his squat example, for his powerlifter, the movements that he's picking to build the quads and knee flexion strength, he's keeping them a little bit further from failure because he's considering, okay, we're picking a less fatiguing exercise globally in the selection. And then we're also going to keep how close we are to concentric failure a little bit further to then even further pull back on how
Yep.
much fatigue that's accumulating, so the power lifter can focus on their back squat performance.
Exactly.
And then we could probably flip that for somebody focusing on muscle building. If you're dealing with the same constraint, right? The
Mhm.
muscles of a squat, the low back, the glutes, the quads, maybe even you include the joints, right? The knees, the
Yeah.
hips. If you're just trying to build muscle, is back squatting a great movement? I think we can both agree, yeah. But is back squatting probably the only movement you want to do? Well,
Absolutely not.
if you need 20 sets of leg work between the glutes and the quad type squatting patterns
Hmm.
and various divisions to really maximize building those muscles, but you can only do 12 of back squats because your knees and hips and low back can only take so much.
Exactly.
That's the constraint I think we're trying to get at here. So
Hmm.
then what do you do? Well, you might still do some back squat because you like them. They're fun. They do provide a good stimulus, but maybe you only do 5 sets in a week. And then you fill in the other 15 sets you need in pendulum squats, hack squats, leg extensions,
Yep.
leg press, and maybe hip thrusts, and some of these other movements that maybe are less taxing on wherever that
Exactly.
limitation is. And so you would think about that, right, Mike, in like a week, right? Because
Hmm.
somebody's doing legs twice a week. You might pick, a certain amount of back squat on one day, and then you might pick more or less fatiguing movements on the muscles that are constrained in
100%.
the back squat
Yep.
on the second day. So then the next week rolls around, they're fresh again to do the back squat. And that could apply for
Exactly.
muscle building or powerlifting, I think, in this example.
Exactly. And I think with hypertrophy training, we also can consider, obviously, in certain muscles, like different divisions, and this is where you start to get into like people going too far into the biomechanics of things. But like something like a leg extension, for example, is going to be primarily like rectus femoris, that middle part of the quad, and it's super isolated, so you're not really causing much fatigue.
Right.
So that's something that you can throw in a session and know that that stimulus to fatigue ratio is really good. And
Right. In
same
that
same thing,
area.
yeah, same thing can apply with some of these other isolated movements like tricep stuff. But my qualm, going back to the whole biomechanics thing, is people basically putting the cart before the horse. So you're focused on these like isolations of these different exact hypertrophy region, trying to create regional hypertrophy and all this stuff when you haven't even tried to establish that global tissue. And there's nothing wrong with isolations because I programmed them plenty, but they tend to be later on in a session after we've already sort of hit those big compound movements. Now, it could also depend if someone is a hypertrophy oriented person and we've identified a weakness and they already have good global tissue. We may target one spot, say someone's lats are lagging and everything else is really good. We may pick movements that are really selected for their lats and do some of those sort of more advanced movements, if you will. I don't want to say they're super advanced, but I think that like beginners just shouldn't worry too much about those like iliac pull downs and stuff like that. Um, but if you're advanced and you've identified that there's an area that could be improved, and you can kind of pull down a lot of the other training closer to maintenance and really hone in on bringing up a specific muscle group, then I think that's a time where we'll use more of those very specific variations.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think what you're touching on too is a little bit of there's a debate if some people are more into the current conversations going on online.
Hmm.
Almost what we're dealing with is we're re-looping. If you've been in the game long enough, you've heard it before: isolations versus compounds.
Hmm.
You're almost looping. Not that these new movements and biomechanics aren't compound, because they will involve. And so, for people that don't know, isolations of movement generally that involves one joint moving. Leg extension is just the knee. The squat is the knee and the hip, so the squat's compound. The leg extension's isolation. Not that some of these new movements aren't isolation, but they are very isolating. So you're
Yeah.
almost dealing with that same global conversation, because somebody might go, well, if the leg extension is less fatiguing than the back squat, why would I not just do a bunch of leg extensions to
Hmm.
make up my quad volume? And I think we could probably both agree that there is a potential drawback. And the reason the compounds are great, one, you can put more absolute load, which at a certain point,
Exactly.
as you pointed out, could be bad because if you get super strong,
Yeah.
now the absolute load is just tiring to manage, to
Yeah.
just have on the body.
Hmm.
So there is that. But the other side too is that, isn't it fatiguing? So the stimulus for a squat is probably higher than a leg extension, meaning
Oh
if you
yeah.
do one set of a good set of hack squats,
Hmm.
yeah, it's more load, it's a little bit more tiring in that moment,
Hmm.
but you could almost say, well, yeah, but I have to do maybe 2 to 3 sets of hard leg extensions to get a similar quad stimulus globally. The
Yeah.
rectus femoris, we're going to leave that out because that is a whole separate
Yeah,
area of
that's
discussion,
fair.
but just simply for the quad only.
Yeah.
But isn't time in the gym tiring? I mean, I don't know about you, but there's
Yeah.
days where I'm like, man, I'm glad I just have like an hour and 20 minutes worth of
That's a
work.
great point.
I don't want to have to do 5 to 6 sets of all these isolations for all these muscles. Now my workout's 2 hours and something. That's part of the consistency, the enjoyment. Is it maybe optimal? Maybe in some ways, right?
Yeah.
It's a sliding scale, but
Hmm.
there's some potential drawback just through time. And I don't really,
Yeah. Yeah.
compounds are time efficient for their
Yeah,
stimulus.
that's a great point. Time efficiency. And you're not always gonna get, as a coach, you're not always gonna get clients that their whole day revolves around training. Most people have 9 to 5s, actual jobs, or they're going to school, or they're working and going to school. So if you're trying to set up a routine that it's everything is isolated and they don't have 2 hours, whereas we could set up a perfectly good day of training with just 5 exercises, they can be done in an hour. So that you could have the most optimal program, but if they're not going to have the time to do it, then it doesn't fucking matter.
Exactly. So maybe we could say, we talked about kind of like, okay, there's a spectrum. Maybe you don't want
Mhm.
to do Bosu ball squat, but maybe you don't want to be doing the maximum back squat load that you can handle in a low bar position if your goal is to build muscle. You probably want to be somewhere in the middle, maybe a high bar squat, hack squat, pendulum. So we could almost say maybe the same concept applies for building muscle from programming. You probably do want to have some of those bread and butter compound movements, heavy loads, but mix in some isolations for the muscles that are priority, that need that touch up,
Yep,
muscles that aren't touched well via compounds, maybe like
exactly.
rear delts,
Hmm.
side delts, right? Both of those are
Yeah,
probably not hit very well by most compounds. So you want to see a mix of kind of these
100%.
different concepts, I think is something that it's a good takeaway for a
Yeah,
lot of
and
people.
the side delts is actually a great example because that's one of those things that you often see power lifters, like if you were to just assess their physique, depending on how much they might do, but if they're just focusing on benching and squatting and deadlifting, they're probably not going to have much delt development. They'll have good front delt development, anterior delt, but because they're never doing lateral movements, they're not going to have that middle delt well developed, which is what really gives that sort of width. And that's, a consideration of an isolation where you do have to use those isolations to target specific tissue. But the issue is when you get hyper focused on isolations and get away from those compounds. It's much easier for me, basically, let me put it this way. If I get a power lifter who's already really, really strong, it's much easier for me to put on a little bit of tissue on certain areas on them versus if you give me some 145-pound kid who's been only doing isolation movements and hyper focus on biomechanics, and I'm just like, you need to just get fucking strong and eat enough for a couple years.
Yeah, there's something about, and the research isn't there yet, right? Hopefully we get more in the future to help us understand. But I think there's just something, there has to be something going on with these big bread and butter stable compound movements that they just seem to pack on muscle at a way that I just haven't seen reflected in people doing these very unique, very specific, isolated movements.
Hmm.
That there just seems to be some difference. Maybe the research will show that that's not true. Maybe it's all an
I,
illusion.
I want to say part of that is the intensity that people bring to training. I think that what I've observed is you'll see sometimes these people focus on these isolations. Maybe they are stopping at 5+ reps in reserve, and so they're not getting close enough to failure. And like I said, they're just not doing enough to get that global stimulus. So yeah, you may be, even if they are progressing on these like hyper specific lat movements, I just don't know if it's enough of a stimulus in general to really build a strong back.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, there's so many ways we could take this. I mean, I can speak
Mhm.
for myself, coming from a powerlifting background. I love performance. So
Mhm.
going in and hitting like going for a PR set of weighted pull-ups
Yeah,
between like 5 and 10 reps gets me way more mentally engaged than
exactly.
sitting down, setting up a very specific movement. But
Mhm.
maybe after I do my pull-ups, a couple sets, I'm engaged, I'm mentally there, I'm in the session now. Now I can switch over to
Exactly.
a more specific setup with the specific lat and the way. And then, now I'm already bought in mentally. There's some of that. There's
Mhm.
some psychological play you're probably right
100%.
about
Yeah. And that's why
that goes into it.
I think those big compounds and pushing like for getting stronger is such a big deal to me, because overall it's going to create that buy-in. And like I said, we want to be seeing those trends in strength come up over time. If you could say that a conventional deadlift's probably not super optimal. But if someone's getting stronger on their conventional deadlift over the course of a couple of years while also getting stronger on various other movements, that's going to result in a lot of lean tissue gain. And so at some point, I may move that person to more of an RDL or stiff leg deadlift. But initially, I'm perfectly okay, because that conventional deadlift can create buy-in and maybe a little bit more global stimulus with that, a little bit more lumbar flexion, building that those spinal erectors as well.
Yeah. And again, I agree with you. And I think also there might be that psychology based aspect where maybe the person loves conventional deadlift, but they don't like RDL. But if you
Exactly.
convince them the RDL builds their conventional deadlift,
Yep.
you now bought buy-in to the movement that's really building the muscle. Now they're
Yep.
putting all the energy, and then maybe at some point they'll love the RDL enough after enough time through exposure, they'll just be like, no, it's okay, we can remove the conventional. So there is a little
Yeah.
bit of that. You're playing with the psychology of
A
people
hundred
doing
percent.
that. Because I think what we're really saying is these details matter. Exercise selection does matter, but it
Mhm.
only matters if you're putting in the right amount of effort, intensity, and
Yep.
buy-in. And however you get
Exactly.
yourself to do that is kind of the first puzzle. And then from there, you of course optimize your exercise selection where possible. And another one I think is worth mentioning with these, we're comparing these more isolating specific setups to these more global big movements. And we touched on it before, but I think it'd be really worth for the listener if we really expand on the idea of loading,
Okay.
right? If you look at a cable stack with these very unique pull down setups,
Hmm.
cable stacks don't usually go up by very small amounts. And it's a
Yeah.
very tough movement to do and set up and stay in position. It
Hmm.
could be that they get to a certain top end of their rep range goal, and then the next stack up is too much for them to do in the same way. Where like a pull down,
Yeah.
if you go up the next rank on a pull down machine, you're good. You're not.
Yeah.
It's not going to drastically throw off your execution.
Exactly.
Where the maybe the load increments are too much of a jump, right? The
Hmm.
sissy squat is one I always think of when
Hmm.
people talk about it. Like, yeah, at first you do a standing regular sissy squat. If anyone doesn't know what it is, look it up. It's a funny looking movement. You're basically on your tippy toes. If you can't
Yeah.
really do it well at first, sure, it's probably a decent quad stimulus until you get to like 20 reps. But after that, how are you going to load that? It's not practical.
Exactly.
You can't
Yeah.
really, I mean, you put what, 10 pounds on you and now you're falling, it just
Yeah.
completely throws off. I think do you agree with that idea
A
that
100%. Yeah.
maybe
That's
something to the ability to load?
exactly. Yeah. And that's why I'm a big fan of things like I'll pick a dumbbell bench over a barbell bench for hypertrophy, just because I like the freedom of movements at the shoulder joint. And you can get into a position that for a lot of people is just going to be a little bit more comfortable and align with the pec fibers a little bit. But some people may argue that a dumbbell bench is not good because you are losing, because of the resistance profile, you are losing a little bit of tension in the end range of motion versus like some sort of like certain chest press machines that have a converging element, which I like that a lot, but I still like dumbbells because one, it's one of my favorite movements, and two, they can be loaded consistently over time. So I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit of that optimal just for the sake of buy-in and intensity that I'm going to bring to that movement, because I'm always thinking like, okay, this was my old dumbbell press PR. Let's see if I can beat that in the next block or two when I reintroduce that movement.
Right. So you're thinking stimulus, optimization plus enjoyment, right? It's the combo.
Exactly.
Plus, I don't know if research will ever get to a point, but I've heard from enough people that there's something different about free weight versus machine. I can't put my finger on it. You could push me to a 10 rep max, zero RAR on a machine press with a very good profile. It stretches the pec, it comes together at the top, maximizes, or you can put me down for a dumbbell press. But the pump, the disruption, the soreness, the way I feel after the dumbbell press is just different. It's just different from the machine. I don't know,
Yeah,
there,
and that's
I don't
that's
know about
something.
you. That's
Yeah.
my experience, but I think there's just maybe something,
It's
they're just
almost
maybe not a one for one.
yeah, yeah, and it's something that I would say is almost like not even quantifiable, at least with any data that I'm aware of, but it's almost like almost primal in a sense where, it just feels more like I just feel more intense about it, grabbing a heavy set of dumbbells, and you just feel more like, all right, like let me tackle this obstacle.
There might be some bias there, the psychology
Yeah,
side for us, because we're
exactly.
powerlifters. We came from a
Yeah,
powerlifting background.
that's
The free
100% true.
weights, the strength, it's very measurable. Because, like, how do you compare a machine at this gym to a machine at that gym to a machine at that gym if they're all different machines?
Yeah, so I
You really,
actually keep data on that. So in my log, I'll write exactly what the brand is, or if it doesn't have a brand written, I'll write like, okay, cable flies at this gym or whatnot, and able to have, so that way I'm able to have that data that's actually accurate. And I know that, okay, my machine chest press on this hoist chest press versus this hammer strength plate loaded press. So I'll keep data there. But while I do use machines a lot, I 100% agree that sometimes you just want to move some heavy free weight, whether it be barbell or dumbbells. And it's just, I think it just goes back to that buy-in element and ability to load it. Like, not that some machines can't be loaded, but I will add this point. Once you get strong enough, there are a lot of machines you'll encounter that you just can't load enough because the stack is not really designed for really, really strong people. Now, there is something, I don't know if you've ever heard or seen the gym pin, which is
yeah,
like,
I've
yeah,
seen it.
so I use one, but like that's not going to be available to everyone unless you buy one. Most gym, I don't think any gym that I'm aware of has one. I just keep one in my gym bag. But yeah, so that's a problem that you may run into. And even some of these machines may not be set up in a way to where you can add plates to them anyway.
Yeah, true.
So because it might not have that little pinhole. It might be like a sliding thing.
And there's consistency too, right? If you know you're going to be traveling between gyms a lot, a dumbbell press is a dumbbell
It's
press.
always going to be the same. Yep.
You don't have to factor, because you do. I mean, I've talked about it with my buddy Sean, my co-host. That yeah, you generally want to, for the most part, do a similar routine week in, week out. It's how you track progress. It's how you create a baseline for stimulus, and then you can see what's going on. It's a little hard if it's a different machine and a different loading every week. Does it mean you're not building muscle? You probably still are, but it's harder to objectively track and measure. So there is
Exactly.
something about a dumbbell press just being a dumbbell press, as well. Plus, I don't know, powerlifting background, performance. There's something nice about being like, hey, I'm up to hundreds. That's respectable in the global lifting community on like an
Exactly.
incline press, right? Incline dumbbell press, where I don't, machine incline press at X weight. It's a little harder to, for me, my performance, my bias from getting into the gym.
Yeah, I
There's a
think
different
that's a
intensity to drive that.
fantastic point you make, and I think that's where I've come at it from that powerlifting background, where I've really tried to create that buy-in in my physique oriented people, because a lot of times, like I said earlier, some programming I've seen for physique oriented individuals is not, there's no focus on intensity or tracking logbook. It's just like very broad recommendations, and there's almost too much of an emphasis on like, oh, form. Like, yeah, execution matters, but like you still need to get stronger over time. And I've
Yeah.
seen this even like, it's a lot more prevalent with like some of the less muscular divisions, like for example, bikini girls. Obviously, once you get to a point of muscular development, you kind of have to stay there. But
Right.
I've seen this occur like at the amateur level where you see these girls that they're doing the honestly comically light weights, and it's like, okay, but you still have tissue to develop it versus like if you compare them to like some of the higher level bikini girls, some of these like pro bikini girls have some pretty great muscular development, and that doesn't happen by doing 5 pound dumbbell presses and RDLs with 95 pounds. Now you may be able to, and this is probably where some confusion arises, you may be able to maintain with a lot less intensity and volume once you've built up that tissue. And I always make this point to people, if I wanted to just maintain my tissue and strength, I could probably only train 45-minute sessions a week and I'm good.
Right.
But if you're still early on in your career and you need to build more lean tissue, you have to get stronger over time.
Yeah.
And so I see that a lot with like some of this physique coaching where they're just sort of thinking it's like, oh, we have to carve in detail or all this stuff. And it's like, you don't have any muscle to begin with. You just have to get stronger globally.
Yeah, I agree. And that kind of segues too, because you brought up the bikini. We've talked a lot of different examples, but I know you train a lot of women
Hmm.
and I know you also train a lot of guys, right? You have a good mix in your clientele of both
Yeah.
genders. So when it comes to exercise selection for building muscle, have you seen any global differences? I mean, of course, everybody's different.
Hmm.
Have you seen something in your clients that are women versus your clients that are men? Have you seen any exercise selection patterns kind of unfold where you're like, yeah, for most women, they can handle a little bit more of this consideration for exercise selection. They have a little more leeway, or this
Yeah.
is a little bit better. And then for men, I kind of have to scale some things. Is there
Mhm.
patterns you see on those global
Yeah, and
levels?
I think it depends kind of what their goals are too. But I would say first of all, from like a volume and frequency standpoint, women tend to be able to handle a little bit more, whether that be from a sort of physiological perspective or maybe just because the absolute loads are not as high. Someone doing a stiff leg deadlift of 500 pounds for reps is going to be more globally fatiguing than someone doing stiff leg deadlifts with 115. But I do tend to see the ability to handle a little bit more volume and a little bit more frequency. And so I will tend to split things, like separate things out a bit more with female clients where they can handle like 3 leg days a week, for example, and
Mm,
be totally fine. Whereas some of my guys would be cooked from more than two like hard leg training sessions a week. I personally train two, yeah, right now I just changed my program a little bit, but I have 2 leg days a week and they're stimulating enough and I can go hard. But I know that if I were to condense that and try to add a third day, I would probably overreach, kind of exceed my recovery capabilities pretty quickly. So I would say from a total volume and frequency standpoint, I've noticed women tend to be able to handle a little bit more. Now, I will say that even then, I still try not to push volume excessively high. I think there tends to be, again, going back to people thinking there's this huge difference in hypertrophy versus strength training. I've seen programs where you might have some girl do 25 sets of legs in a day. And so my question is, how many of those sets were taken even to 3 reps in reserve? Probably not many, if any at all.
no, no, not if, I mean, 25. I mean, that was my example with the marathon, right? I mean, they're
Mhm.
tired because they've been in the gym for 2.5 hours more so than they are
Exactly.
from actually
So
doing.
yeah, so a lot of times if I've gotten girls that come from those types of programs, I do pull their volume down, and we just really focus on teaching them intensity and execution. Like even if their execution is really good, a lot of times the intensity is not there, and that's why I will use in my physique athletes kind of a progression in RIR within a training block to where we progress to a 0 RIR towards the end of the training block. And the reason why, and I'm stealing this idea from, I don't know if you're familiar with data-driven strength.
Mhm, yeah.
So they made a post about this called an RPE or RIR audit. Basically, having weeks where we do go to a 0 RIR. Is it absolutely necessary? No, we know that that's a little bit more fatiguing, and we know that you could stick to like 1 to 3 RIR and make plenty of progress. But these 0 RIR weeks are an audit where someone may be undershooting and they think that something that was a 2 or 3 RIR, when they actually are tasked with going to failure, they may do 5 or 6 more reps than they thought. And now we have that data going forward. So I think with women, one of the big things is just learning intensity, especially coming from that physique background where there's this misconception that training for physique or bikini or what have you is about like just a ton of volume and super duper duper perfect form. Like, it's fine to have a decent amount of volume. It's great to have amazing execution, but if your intensity is not there, you're just not going to build that lean tissue.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm glad that you took some time to kind of explain some of those pitfalls with training that a lot of women fall into, but also kind of clarifying. So it seems like from your experience, if I understand right, just for a broad understanding, just make sure I got it, you see that maybe women can handle more frequency of almost regardless of exercise selection. Like the
Yeah,
same concepts apply, but they kind of handle more. They have a little more
yeah,
leeway. And then for men, they if exercise selection maybe becomes a little bit more of an important conversation because they don't have as much recoverability. That
yeah.
leeway is a little bit smaller,
Hmm.
right? So maybe for men, yeah, you need 15 sets to really build your pecs. They're lagging. Maybe we don't want to make that all barbell
Yeah,
bench, right? Because of the constraints. Maybe we want to diversify. But for a woman who needs 15 sets, she might be able to do more barbell more
yeah,
often. She can get away with a
exactly.
little bit more. It's kind of what you're
Yeah,
saying. But at
yeah,
some point, it might still matter for them. So it's worth everybody understanding these ideas and
100%.
understanding because one of the things with recovery, there's, in my opinion, there's kind of like once you take out the other things, which I'll love to have you back on to talk about, which is like
Mm.
sleep, stress management,
Yeah.
caloric intake, protein intake, these other big pillars.
Hmm.
But if you're training too much and you're feeling run down, you got too much fatigue, there's only a couple of ways to really alleviate that from a training perspective. And maybe you would agree, but it's, you could take some downtime, light days or a deload. So
Yeah.
take some easier training.
Hmm.
You can reduce the training volume. So not moving any of your exercises, just doing less total sets, less, or you can try switching the exercises to be less fatiguing, which is kind of
Yeah.
the pillar that the thing that we're talking about today
Yeah.
as an area where people can change. And I think it really comes down to the conclusion that say, hey, you need a certain amount of volume per hard sets near concentric failure to maybe build a
Yeah.
certain muscle.
Hmm.
And if you can't do it with the exercises you're picking because of the extra stress you're getting, the extra fatigue, I think
Hmm.
we both agree that maybe now exercise selection and things we're talking about today become very important in that
Absolutely.
consideration.
And I would add that it also is factored in the goals of the individual. For example, a male who's doing classic physique may not be as focused on glutes to the extent as a bikini or a wellness girl. So exercise selection and obviously volume distribution is going to be factored in there. And so, if I have bikini or wellness girls, we are going to use some of those glute isolations. We still are going to use those bread and butter, some sort of squat pattern, some sort of hip hinge, but we may be using a little bit more frequency of like hip thrust variations and cable kickbacks and things that are isolating the glutes more because we want to target that particular tissue to grow.
I think that's a good way to help people focus too. Like if you got a muscle you got to focus on is what I'm hearing.
Hmm.
Maybe focusing on these less fatiguing movements can allow you to move that needle of specificity
Exactly.
to build those muscles up, right? Ticking those boxes better. Because again, we have
100%.
constraints with certain movements. Again, like a back squat, barbell row, bench press. Not that they're not fun. I think they could be perfectly great movements, but
Hmm.
at some level, you probably aren't going to maximize your muscle building progress focusing only on those
Exactly.
as the nuts and bolts of your or the majority of your program. But those are all the main questions I had for you, man. Is there anything else on this general topic of exercise selection for muscle building you really want people to think about, focus on? Any last comments you want to kind of put in there?
I would say just at the end of the day, a lot of this minutia doesn't matter as much as a lot of people think it does. The main things are going to be just consistency and time in the gym. You know, you take someone training hard for 10 years, even if some of their training may be suboptimal, if they're bringing a lot of intensity, they're paying attention to recovery, they're probably going to go a long way. Whereas, you know, some of these people focus on this specialization, they may not build that global tissue, or they may just burn out because they get so focused on these minutia, and then maybe get burned out and to just maybe walk away from strength training, especially when you consider the psychological aspect of like the enjoyment of tracking load and getting stronger over time. And that's one thing that, like we touched on already, is such a big deal, especially coming from a powerlifting background. Like, I'm very, very performance driven. So no matter what the movement is, I'm tracking my performance, and over time I want to get stronger on it. So I would advise people to train with intensity, obviously not at the expense of execution, but you know, train hard, get stronger over time. And if you're early on in your journey, it's not bad to do some of these like hyper specialized biomechanics movements, if you will, but I would maybe save them for later in your training session after you've already hit more of those compounds and created a big global stimulus.
I think that's very well said. And I agree. I got,
Mhm.
you know, I agree. The only thing that that last comment that you proposed that kind of sparked for me is a little bit of, you were talking about it before, but you said a lot of your physique athletes, you really want them to have that performance driven mindset, that buy-in. You know, even if you're not someone who performance isn't your driver, right? Because everybody's got their internal motivators. They're things that make them tick. For me, it's performance. I love seeing progress.
Mhm.
But even if that's not you, muscle building is a long process. It takes
Mhm.
a long time. And there is some research showing that maybe for some people there can be some disordered thought patterns in different areas with food and body composition and lifestyle if they're only focused on the way that they look,
Yep.
right? That that is going to be for everyone, but there might be something they're driving.
That's a
And
great
one of the
point.
ways that help with that is focusing on what your body's capable of, what the human body can do. And so
Yes.
focusing on performance can be a great long-term perspective for a lot of people to get them to build the muscle that's going to take 10 years, five
Exactly.
years.
Yeah. I think that, you know, you can see changes in terms of like fat loss relatively quickly. Physiologically speaking, it's a lot easier process, but it's that building, those building phases that are just going to be, they take time, and there's nothing, you can't force it.
No. And you're probably going to have to build some body, you know, gain some body fat you don't really want to gain when you're building muscle because it's a first, and I've talked about it in a previous episode, but you know, how do you maximize muscle growth? It's in a caloric surplus.
Hmm.
With that is likely to come some body fat. Well, if somebody's very focused on their physique, they don't have these performance driven mindsets, that might they might turn off the bulking mass building process early. They might shut
Yeah,
all that down because of that. But if they're focused on performance, then they can just kind of bask in the fact that, okay, maybe I'm not as lean as I want to be, but hey, all these numbers are moving, everything's
yeah,
going up, I'm having fun, I'm making progress. And those that long-term performance buy-in, it's not the focus of this episode, but for anyone listening, I don't think either of us can emphasize it enough that there's a
exactly.
lot of upsides,
Oh
and
yeah.
exercise selection is just one component in that puzzle that can fit in to help you find movements that meet your goals, that you can buy into to then perform on over time to get you where you want to go in your muscle building journey.
100%. Yeah, I agree completely.
Yeah. So um, it was great having you, man. I really appreciate it. I hope I can get you on again.
For sure.
Very good conversation. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too.
If the people enjoy it, hopefully they'll let me know. If they don't, doesn't matter. I enjoyed it.
That was
But
a good time.
let people know where they can find you. You know, you're an active coach, you're on social media and everything. Let people know where they can get a hold of you.
Yeah, I tend to be most active on Instagram, Michael Salazar 198. And, you know, if anyone has any questions or coaching inquiries or anything like that, you can just message me. And that's where I'm most active. I have a TikTok, but I don't really use it that much. I should probably get on that though.
get on the algorithm, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, for anyone who's not following Mike, I highly suggest it. Great posts, great example videos of what good exercise execution looks like, close to failure, right? Having that visual perspective for those people that don't quite know what that looks like. You talked about the audits for themselves, but some people don't, they just don't know,
Yeah, I
right?
think
They
it's
don't
a
know.
skill,
So,
honestly, that you have to
so,
develop.
so I can't encourage people enough to follow you. Great content.
Thank you.
And I appreciate you having you on, man. And
Thanks
hopefully
for
we'll have you
having
on
me
again
on.
soon.
All right. Appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave us a rating and review wherever you are listening, if you are listening to the audio-only version of this podcast. If on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe. Please let us know if you did or didn't like the episode, and all feedback is helpful. We will be releasing another episode 2 weeks from now. You can find us at Overcoming Resistance on YouTube and at Overcoming_Resistance on Instagram. Have a great day and take care.